In the iron-fisted world of the Seoul underworld, Kang Dae-hyun's word is law. But as he lines up the most powerful heiresses in the country to find a suitable new mother of the Syndicate, he meets a resistance he can't crush with force. His 10-year-old daughter, Mina. For 8 years, she hasn't known the touch of a socialite or the cold calculations of a political marriage. She has only known the warmth and safety of the woman who stepped in when the world went dark. Now, the most feared man in Korea is about to learn that while he can buy an empire, he can't buy a mother's love. The auditions are over, and Mina has already chosen the winner. The penthouse office was a tomb of obsidian and glass, cold enough to turn a man's breath to mist. Kang Dae-hyun sat behind his desk, the flickering lights of Seoul's skyline reflected in his dark, unreadable eyes. Across from him, the Syndicate elders sat in a row, their faces etched with the impatience of men who viewed family as nothing more than a strategic asset. A throne without a queen is a liability, Dae-hyun. Elder Moon rasped, his voice like dry parchment. The Syndicate needs stability. Mina needs a mother with a pedigree that commands respect, not just a shadow following her through the halls. The alliances are waiting. The suitors are prepared. Dae-hyun didn't blink. He ruled the underworld with surgical precision, treating every threat as a math problem to be solved. But his 10-year-old daughter, Mina, was the one variable he couldn't calculate. Through the heavy, soundproof doors of his office, he could see her in the lounge. She looked small against the vast, minimalist furniture, her fingers white-knuckled as she clutched a worn, one-eyed teddy bear. To the elders, she was the future of the empire. To Dae-hyun, she was a fragile reminder of a life he had failed to protect 8 years ago. Whenever a guard walked past or a phone buzzed with the harsh vibration of a business deal, Mina flinched. She lived in a world of sharp edges and cold steel, a place where even the walls seemed to watch her with judgment. But then, the heavy doors hummed open. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. It wasn't the arrival of a high society bride or a cold-eyed assassin. It was a woman who moved with a quiet, grounding grace that seemed to absorb the room's tension. She didn't look like she belonged in a Mafia stronghold, yet she was the only one who truly did. As soon as Mina caught the scent of vanilla and cocoa butter, the tension drained from her small shoulders. She didn't wait for permission. She let go of the teddy bear and flew across the room, burying her face in the nanny's side. The woman's dark hands moved with practiced tenderness, one resting on Mina's head and the other stroking her back in a rhythm that matched the girl's heartbeat. Dae-hyun watched from his desk, his gaze softening for a fraction of a second before the mask of the boss returned. The elders saw a servant who had stayed too long. Mina saw a sanctuary. In that moment, as the elders spoke of political mergers and elite bloodlines, Dae-hyun realized the war for his daughter's heart had already been won, and the women they were recruiting didn't stand chance. The rain in Seoul that night didn't just fall, it hammered against the windows like the frantic heartbeat of a dying man. Inside the Kang estate, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and the metallic tang of a world that had just been shattered. A younger, hollow-eyed Dae-hyun stood in the center of the nursery, his suit jacket discarded and his white shirt stained with the bitter reality of his new life. He was a man who could command an army of thousands, yet he stood paralyzed before a small, wooden crib. Inside, 2-year-old Mina was screaming. It wasn't the cry of a hungry child. It was a raw, primal wail for a mother who would never walk through the door again. Every time Dae-hyun reached out, his hands that knew only how to take and how to break, trembled. He was a king of shadows, utterly useless in the light of a child's grief. The guards stood like statues in the hallway, their eyes averted, terrified of the vulnerability radiating from their boss. Then, the heavy oak doors creaked open. She didn't enter with a flourish or a bow. She simply walked in, her coat damp from the storm and a worn bag slung over her shoulder. The elders had sent her as a temporary fix, a woman from a world far removed from the glitz of the Syndicate. As she approached the crib, the guard stepped back instinctively, silenced by the sheer calm she carried. Dae-hyun watched, breathless, as she bypassed him entirely. She didn't offer the boss her credentials or wait for a command. Instead, she reached into the crib. "Little bird," she whispered, her voice a deep, resonant melody that seemed to cut through the thunder. Her dark hands, steady and warm, scooped the hysterical toddler against her chest. Mina's screams caught in her throat. She struggled for a moment, her tiny fists thumping against the woman's sweater, but the nanny didn't flinch. She began to sway, a slow, rhythmic motion that felt like the tide coming in. She hummed a low tune, a song that had no language but spoke of safety and endurance. Slowly, the toddler's jagged breaths smoothed out. Mina's tiny fingers uncurled from her tear-stained blanket and latched onto the woman's collar, finding a new anchor in the storm. Dae-hyun sank into a nearby chair, the weight of the night finally crushing him. He looked at the woman, this stranger who had done in seconds what his entire empire could not. In the dim glow of the nightlight, he saw the beginning of a bond that no bullet could pierce and no contract could buy. He didn't know her name yet, but as Mina finally fell into a deep, exhausted sleep against her shoulder, he knew the shadow of 2 years old had found its light. The grand dining hall was a cathedral of marble and gold, illuminated by a chandelier that dripped with crystal ice. It was a room designed to intimidate, a stage for the parade of ice queens that the Syndicate had orchestrated. Dae-hyun sat at the head of the long table, his expression a frozen mask, while a succession of the country's most eligible heiresses took the seat opposite him. Each woman was a masterpiece of surgical perfection and designer silk, their smiles as curated as their family portfolios. Mina sat to his right, looking like a captured bird in a dress of stiff, uncomfortable lace. Her small hands were hidden beneath the table, twisting the hem of her skirt. Behind her, standing like a silent sentinel in the shadows, was the nanny. She was dressed in her usual simple, dark attire, her presence the only thing keeping the young girl from bolting out of the room. The first suitor, the daughter of a shipping magnate, didn't even look at the child. She spent the first course discussing the expansion of the Busan docks, her eyes fixed solely on Dae-hyun's power. When she finally acknowledged Mina, it was only to offer a practiced, shallow compliment. "She'll be such a lovely asset to our public image," the woman remarked, her tone suggesting Mina was a handbag to be coordinated with a season's wardrobe. When her water glass was refilled, she snapped her fingers at the nanny without looking up, her voice sharp and dismissive. "More lemon, and be quick about it." Dae-hyun's fork stopped midair. He watched as the nanny leaned in, her movements fluid and calm, providing the lemon with a grace that far outshone the woman demanding it. The second suitor was worse. She treated the dinner as an audition for a role she had already won. She spoke over Mina, discussing proper boarding schools in Switzerland that would fix the girl's shy temperament. When the nanny reached forward to adjust Mina's napkin, a small gesture of comfort that made the girl's shoulders drop, the suitor's eyes flashed with cold irritation. "Really, Dae-hyun," she sighed, waving a manicured hand toward the nanny. "You've let the staff get far too comfortable. A child of your status shouldn't be so attached to the help. It's quite common." Mina flinched, her eyes darting to the nanny with a look of pure terror, fearing the words might come true. But the nanny didn't move. She merely placed a steady hand on the back of Mina's chair, a silent promise of permanence. Dae-hyun looked at the woman across from him, a woman with a perfect pedigree and a heart of dry stone. He looked at the other elite suitors waiting in the foyer, all of them viewing his daughter as a hurdle to be cleared or an accessory to be polished. Then he looked at the woman in the shadows, the one who had seen him at his weakest and his daughter at her most broken. The interviews were meant to find a mother, but as the Ice Queens preened and plotted, Dae-hyun realized they were only proving how irreplaceable the woman behind the chair truly was. The gilded halls of the Kang estate, usually a place of terrifying order, were becoming a battlefield of silent defiance. Mina, once the quiet shadow who vanished into the architecture, had transformed into a whirlwind of calculated chaos. It began during the afternoon tea with Lady Shin, a woman whose family controlled the nation's largest steel refineries. As the heiress leaned in to offer a stiff, practiced smile, Mina accidentally tipped a pitcher of dark pomegranate juice directly onto the woman's ivory silk gown. The stain spread like a crimson wound, and the shrieks of the lady echoed through the vaulted ceilings. But Mina merely stared at her with eyes as cold as her father's. Dae-hyun watched from the gallery, his jaw tightening. This was the third dress this week. The following evening, at a gala intended to introduce Mina to the Syndicate's preferred choice, the girl simply stopped speaking. She became a statue, refusing to acknowledge the elegant women who tried to coax a response from her with expensive dolls and promises of Parisian shopping trips. When the daughter of a rival clan tried to pat her cheek, Mina stepped back with such visceral disgust that the entire room fell into an awkward, suffocating silence. By the time the last suitor had been escorted out, fuming about the lack of discipline in the household, Dae-hyun finally cornered his daughter in the library. The room was dim, the only light coming from the fireplace that cast long, dancing shadows across the rows of leather-bound books. Mina was sitting on the floor, her back to the mahogany desk, meticulously mending a tear in her nanny's apron with a clumsy 10-year-old stitch. Mina, Dae-hyun's voice was a low rumble, the sound that usually made grown men tremble. These women are here for our future. Your behavior is a stain on the family name. Lady Shin is one of the most powerful women in the country. Why must you be so difficult? Mina didn't look up. She pulled the thread through the fabric with a sharp, defiant tug. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the hearth. She doesn't know how I like my tea, Mina whispered, her voice small but ironclad. Dae-hyun frowned, confused by the triviality of the complaint. What? We have a kitchen full of staff for that, Mina. A mother doesn't need to. She doesn't know, Mina interrupted, finally looking up. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, reflecting the firelight. She doesn't know that I like it with 3 stirs and a drop of honey when I've had a nightmare. She doesn't know that the steam has to smell like home. None of them know me, Papa. They only see the dress I'm wearing. She stood up, clutching the apron to her chest like a shield. As she walked past her father, she didn't need to say anything else. Dae-hyun stood in the silence of the library, the strategic necessity of his marriage suddenly feeling like a hollow, freezing weight against the warmth of a simple cup of tea. Park Jina, the daughter of a prominent political ally, was not a woman who accepted defeat. Unlike the others, she didn't see Mina's tantrums as a lack of discipline. She saw them as a tactical defense coordinated by the woman in the shadows. To Jina, the nanny was not a servant. She was a rival. On a Tuesday afternoon, while Dae-hyun was away at a high-stakes summit, Jina arrived at the estate unannounced. She didn't head for the parlor. Instead, she marched straight into the nursery, her designer heels clicking like a countdown on the hardwood floor. She found a nanny, sitting on a low stool, patiently helping Mina with a complex puzzle of the ancient world. Pack your things, Jina said, her voice a sharp blade that cut through the quiet hum of the room. She tossed a thick envelope onto the puzzle, scattering the pieces. I've already spoken to the Syndicate's Human Resources Division. You're being reassigned to the coastal estate in Jeju. Effective immediately, there is a generous severance for your years of service. Mina's face went white. She scrambled off her chair, her small hands clutching the nanny's skirt so hard her knuckles turned ghostly. No, she gasped, her voice trembling. Papa didn't say that. You can't. The nanny didn't stand up immediately. She calmly placed a hand over Mina's, anchoring the girl. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace, she rose to her full height. She didn't look at the envelope. She looked directly into Gina's eyes with a gaze that was neither subservient nor aggressive. It was simply immovable. The master did not give this order, the nanny said softly. I'm the future matriarch of this house, Jina hissed, stepping closer until she was inches away. I'm making the order. You are a distraction. You are making this child soft, and rebellious. If you stay, I will ensure your reputation is ruined across the city. Is this job really worth your life? The nanny didn't flinch at the threat. A quiet, steel-like strength radiated from her, the kind of power that comes from having nothing left to fear because you've already survived the worst. This isn't a job, Mississippi Park, she replied, her voice steady and resonant. A job is something you leave when the pay is low or the boss is unkind. But I have held this child through every nightmare for 8 years. I have wiped every tear and celebrated every small victory while her father was building his world. She stepped forward, forcing Jina to take an involuntary step back. I'm not staying for the paycheck or the title. I am staying because Mina needs to know that love doesn't have a price tag, and it doesn't run away when a louder voice enters the room. You may tell the master whatever you wish, but I am not leaving her side. Jina opened her mouth to scream, but the raw, maternal authority in the nanny's eyes silenced her. For the first time, the Ice Queen realized she wasn't fighting a servant. She was fighting a mother. The council chamber was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and ancient, suffocating tradition. The Syndicate elders sat in a semicircle of high-backed leather chairs, their faces obscured by the dim, amber light. They didn't speak of love or childhood. They spoke of logistics, port holdings, and the unification of the North and South territories. To them, the parade of Ice Queens had been a formality, and their patience had finally run dry. The Park family merger is the only way to insulate our interests against the new legislation, Elder Moon declared, slamming a heavy folder onto the oak table. Your daughter's whims are irrelevant, Dae-hyun. A 10-year-old does not dictate the movement of an empire. Choose Park Jina by the week's end, or we will begin the process of appointing a new successor who understands the weight of the Kang name. Dae-hyun felt the walls of his own kingdom closing in. He was the boss, the man who decided who lived and died, yet he felt like a prisoner to the very ghost of his father's legacy. He retreated to the private wing of the estate, finding Mina in the solarium. She was staring out at the rain-slicked gardens, her small hand pressed against the cold glass. The nanny was nearby, mending a lace collar, her presence a silent, grounding force in the storm of his mind. Mina, he started, his voice sounding hollow even to his own ears. He knelt beside her, trying to bridge the vast distance that his world had created between them. There are things you don't understand about our family. The way we stay safe, it requires alliances. A marriage to Mississippi Park isn't about replacing your mother. It's about building a shield around you. It's a necessity. Mina didn't turn away from the window. Her reflection in the glass looked older than 10, her eyes filled with a weary clarity. A shield made of ice, Papa? She told the nanny to leave. She told her she was just the help. Dae-hyun's heart stuttered. He looked toward the nanny, who remained silent, her needle moving steadily through the fabric, though her eyes met his with a quiet, unflinching sadness. I can't live in a house where the person who loves me is treated like a ghost, Mina whispered, finally looking at him. A single tear tracked down her cheek, but her jaw was set with the same iron resolve that had made the Kang name famous. If you marry her for the Syndicate, then you're choosing the Syndicate over me. Is that the necessity, Papa? Am I just a piece of the merger too? Dae-hyun reached for her hand, but she pulled back, clutching her teddy bear as if it were the last honest thing left in the house. He stood up, the silence of the room more deafening than the elder's threats. For the first time in his life, the king of the underworld realized that his most powerful alliance was the one he was currently dismantling. The night was a jagged blade of lightning and frantic motion. The Kang estate, usually a fortress of silent discipline, had erupted into a hive of controlled panic. Black SUVs tore through the gravel drive, their headlights cutting through the torrential rain like desperate eyes. Radios crackled with the sharp, panicked voices of security teams reporting the impossible. The fourth-floor balcony was empty, the silk sheets were cold, and the 10-year-old heir to the Syndicate had vanished into the heart of storm. In the command center, Dae-hyun stood before a wall of monitors, his face a ghostly pale mask of fury and terror. Beside him, Park Jina paced in her silk robe, her voice pitched in a shrill, hysterical frequency. "The scandal, Dae-hyun. If the rival families find out she's gone, they'll think we've lost control. This is an embarrassment to the merger." She wasn't looking at the GPS trackers or the thermal scans. She was checking her own reflection in the darkened windows, worried about the optics of a runaway child. Dae-hyun didn't even hear her. He was watching the grainy footage of a small shadow slipping past the perimeter fence, clutching a worn teddy bear to her chest. His world, his empire, his alliances, his bloodline, felt like a house of cards ready to collapse under a single drop of rain. "She's not on the cameras anymore," a technician whispered, his voice trembling. "She's gone off-grid." The nanny stood at the edge of the room, ignored by the tech teams and the frantic suitors. She didn't look at the screens. She looked at the way the wind was whipping the willow trees toward the old, abandoned chapel on the far edge of the estate, a place where the wild lilies grew, the same flowers Mina's mother had loved. She remembered a whispered conversation from 3 nights ago, a small voice asking if heaven was cold when it rained. "She isn't in the city," the nanny said, her voice low but cutting through the noise like a bell. Dae-hyun turned, his eyes wild. "How do you know?" "My men have checked every exit." "Your men look for targets," she replied, stepping toward him. "They don't look for a grieving child." She didn't wait for his command. She grabbed a heavy wool coat and headed for the side door, her movements purposeful and calm. "Wait," Jina shouted, her face contorted with indignation. "You're just a servant. You'll only make the scandal worse." The nanny stopped, her hand on the brass latch. She looked at the woman who wanted to be the new matriarch, then at the father who was realizing his daughter was a stranger to him. "You're worried about the scandal," the nanny said, her dark eyes flashing with a sudden, protective fire. "I'm worried about the girl who thinks the world has no room for her heart. Stay here with your headlines. I'm going to get my daughter." Before Dae-hyun could find his voice, she was gone, disappearing into the black maw of the storm, guided by a compass that no Syndicate satellite could ever track. The old chapel at the edge of the estate was a skeleton of stone and ivy, forgotten by the Syndicate, but remembered by the broken-hearted. When Dae-hyun finally arrived, his boots crunching over wet gravel and shattered glass, he was a man stripped of his titles. The rain had soaked through his expensive wool coat, and the cold had finally seeped into his bones. He pushed open the heavy wooden doors, his breath hitching in the silence of the sanctuary. The air inside smelled of damp earth and old incense. In the center of the nave, beneath a stained glass window that had long ago lost its color, sat the nanny. She was huddled on a stone bench, her coat wrapped around a small, shivering bundle. Mina was curled into her lap, her face buried in the crook of the woman's neck, her small hands clutching the nanny's sweater as if it were the only thing keeping her on the earth. Dae-hyun stopped 10 paces away. He had prepared a lecture on safety, a speech about the Syndicate's reputation, and a reprimand for the security breach. But the words died in his throat. The nanny didn't look up with fear. She didn't apologize for the girl's rebellion or beg for her job. Instead, she slowly rocked back and forth, her hands stroking Mina's hair in a steady, hypnotic rhythm. She was whispering a story, not of empires or bloodlines, but of a mother who lived in the stars and a girl who was never, ever alone. In that moment, the flickering light of a single candle revealed a truth Dae-hyun had been too blind to see. He thought of the elite suitors back at the mansion, women who had spent the night calculating the damage to their social standing. He thought of the elders who saw Mina as a chess piece. In 8 years, through every fever, every nightmare, and every milestone, not a single one of them had ever looked at his daughter with this kind of raw, selfless devotion. The nanny's gaze finally met his. Her eyes weren't the eyes of a servant. They were the eyes of a guardian who had stood at the gates of hell to keep a child safe. She didn't say a word, but her expression asked the only question that mattered. "Are you here to take her back to the cold, Or are you here to finally come home? Dae-hyun's knees hit the stone floor. The king of the underworld looked at the woman holding his child and realized that his empire was a hollow shell. He didn't see the help or a strategic liability. He saw the only person who had ever truly loved the Kangs without a contract. As Mina let out a soft, sleepy sigh and finally relaxed into the nanny's embrace, Dae-hyun realized the revelation at the edge of the city was simple. He had been looking for a queen, but his daughter had already found a mother. The boardroom was a theater of sharpened knives and cold intentions. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the static of impending violence. At the center of the mahogany table sat the contract, a leather-bound document that would unite the Kang Syndicate with the Park political dynasty, a merger worth more than the lives of 1,000 men. The elders leaned forward, their pens poised like daggers, waiting for the signature that would cement their legacy. Dae-hyun stood at the head of the table, his silhouette framed by the panoramic glass of the Seoul skyline. He looked down at the gold-nibbed pen in his hand, then at Park Jina, who sat opposite him with a triumphant, brittle smile. She was already mentally redecorating his house, purging the clutter of his daughter's life to make room for her own ambition. "Sign it, Dae-hyun," Elder Moon commanded, his voice a low rattle. "The alliances are set. The cameras are waiting downstairs for the announcement. Do not let a child's tantrum derail a century of progress." Dae-hyun didn't pick up the pen. Instead, he slowly closed the leather folder. The sound was as sharp as a gunshot in the silent room. "The merger is off," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that made the guards at the door stiffen. "The interviews are over. There will be no marriage to the Park family." The explosion was instantaneous. Jina surged to her feet, her face contorting into a mask of humiliated fury. "You're throwing away a seat at the national table for a servant? You're making a mockery of my family." Behind her, the elders erupted in a chorus of outrage, their threats of insurrection and financial ruin echoing off the marble walls. They spoke of blood purity, strategic suicide, and the weakness of a man who listened to his heart. Dae-hyun didn't flinch. He looked at the men who had raised him in a world of shadows, men who measured worth in territory and ignored the hollow ache of a lonely home. "You call it weakness," Dae-hyun said, his dark eyes locking onto Elder Moon's. "But I have spent 8 years watching a woman build a fortress of warmth around my daughter with nothing but her bare hands. You offer me a shield made of ice and a house that smells of stagnant ambition." He walked toward the door, leaving the billion-dollar contract abandoned on the table. "A cold house is no place for a child to grow up," he added, pausing at the threshold. "And I will not spend the rest of my life watching my daughter shiver in the dark just to satisfy your ledgers." As he stepped out into the hallway, the backlash roared behind him, a storm of legal threats and blood feuds. But for the first time in a decade, the king of the underworld breathed easily. The contract was broken, but his family was finally beginning to heal. The silence of the estate had changed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating quiet of a tomb, but the soft, expectant hush of a home catching its breath. In the private garden, where the late-blooming lilies mirrored the ones from Mina's mother's favorite stories, Dae-hyun found her. The nanny was sitting on a stone bench, her dark hands resting in her lap, watching Mina chase a butterfly through the tall grass. For the first time in 8 years, she wasn't wearing her uniform. Dae-hyun approached slowly, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. He looked at the woman who had been a shadow in his halls, the woman who had seen his grief, his coldness, and his daughter's deepest fears without ever wavering. He realized then that he didn't even know her favorite color, yet she knew the exact rhythm of his daughter's heart. "The Syndicate elders are gone," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rasp. "The merger is dead. The interviews are over." She looked up at him, her expression unreadable but her eyes steady. "And what does that mean for the little bird?" she asked, nodding toward Mina. Dae-hyun sat beside her, the distance between them suddenly feeling like a bridge he had spent a lifetime trying to cross. It means I am done looking for a partner who brings a dowry. I'm looking for the woman who brought my daughter back to life. He reached out, his hand hesitant before covering hers. I don't want you to stay because of a contract. I don't want to pay you to love her anymore. I want you to stay because this house is a hollow shell without you. I want you to be the heart of this family, not as a nanny, as my wife, as her mother. The woman's breath hitched, and for a fleeting second, the stoic mask she had worn for years crumbled, revealing a vulnerability that matched his own. She didn't answer with words. She simply turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with his. 1 month later, the grand ballroom of the Shiloh was packed with the elite of the underworld and the cream of Seoul society. The air was thick with scandalized whispers and the sharp scent of tension. The Syndicate expected a retreat, an apology for the canceled merger. Instead, the heavy doors swung open to a sight that defied a century of tradition. Dae-hyun walked onto the stage, but he wasn't alone. On his left stood Mina, beaming in a dress of vibrant, joyful yellow, her hand gripped tight by the woman on his right. The nanny stood tall, draped in midnight blue silk that complemented her deep complexion, her presence commanding more respect than any ice queen ever could. Dae-hyun stepped to the microphone, his gaze sweeping over the shocked faces of the elders. "Tradition says a king chooses a crown," he said, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "But a father chooses a home. I introduce to you the new matriarch of the Kang family." As the flashbulbs erupted and the whispers turned to a roar, Mina looked up at the woman she had chosen, and the woman who had chosen her back. The contract was gone, the empire was shaken, but for the first time in a decade, the 10-year-old heiress finally knew she was home.